There is a moment in every human life when you look into the mirror and realize the face staring back is a stranger, not because your features have changed, but because something deeper has shifted. The mask you've been wearing, the carefully constructed identity you've presented to the world, to your friends, to your family, even to yourself, suddenly feels like a costume. And in that moment, a terrifying question surfaces from the depths of your consciousness. Who am I beneath all of this? This question is not abstract philosophy. It is the beginning of a collapse, a sacred destruction that mystics have called ego death, that psychologists have termed identity crisis, and that you, in the privacy of your sleepless nights, might simply call the unraveling. Welcome to the most painful and most necessary journey you will ever take, the journey of letting go of your false selves. Imagine, if you will, a theater where you have been performing since childhood. You learned your lines before you could speak. You studied your character before you understood what it meant to have one. The stage lights have been bright, the audience applauding or jeering according to your performance. You became so skilled at playing this role that you forgot it was a role at all. You mistook the actor for the authentic self. You confused the performance with reality. But now, standing in the wings, you feel the costume growing heavy. The makeup begins to crack. The script that once felt natural now sounds hollow in your mouth. You are exhausted, not from living, but from pretending to live. This is where our journey begins tonight. Not in the comfortable illusion of who you think you should be, but in the uncomfortable truth of what you must become. We are going to explore the architecture of false identity, the psychology of self-deception, and the agonizing beauty of authentic transformation. We will descend into the darker territories of the psyche, where the constructed self meets its annihilation, and we will emerge, though changed, though scarred, into a more honest encounter with existence itself. The path ahead is not easy. It requires you to question everything you believed about yourself. It demands you face the possibility that large portions of your personality are borrowed, inherited, or invented to please others. It asks you to sit with the discomfort of not knowing who you are while you strip away who you are not. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Tonight, we honor that pain. We recognize it not as failure, but as the birth pangs of authentic selfhood. Consider this. You are not one person. You are a parliament of selves, each one constructed for different audiences, different circumstances, different fears. There is the self you present at work, competent, controlled, professional. There is the self you become with family, perhaps obedient, perhaps rebellious, shaped by dynamics older than your memory. There is the self you project on social media, curated, filtered, optimized for approval. There is the self you become in romantic relationships, vulnerable or guarded, depending on your wounds. And there is the self you hide even from yourself, the one that holds your secrets, your shame, your unacceptable desires. Which of these is real? The answer that will slowly reveal itself tonight is none of them and all of them. Each is a mask, yet each contains a fragment of truth. The work of becoming authentic is not about choosing one mask and calling it real. It is about understanding why you needed the masks in the first place, and then carefully, courageously setting them down. But here is what makes this journey so excruciating. These false selves are not your enemies. They were your protectors. Each one was created for a reason, to help you survive, to earn love, to avoid rejection, to navigate a world that felt dangerous or unwelcoming. The false self is not a villain in your story. It is a child who did their best to keep you safe. And now you must thank that child and gently explain that you no longer need their protection. You must dismantle the fortress they built, stone by stone, even as part of you screams in terror that without these walls, you will be destroyed. This is the paradox we will explore tonight. The pain of letting go is matched only by the pain of holding on. To release your false selves feels like death because, in a very real sense, it is death. It is the death of who you pretended to be so that who you actually are might finally breathe. The ancient mystics understood this. They spoke of it in riddles and koans, in dark nights of the soul, in spiritual deserts where the ego goes to die. The modern psychologists understand it too, though they use different language. They speak of individuation, of integration, of the dissolution of maladaptive personas. The neuroscientists are beginning to map it in brain states, in the quieting of the default mode network, in moments when the constructed self temporarily goes offline and something more fundamental is revealed. But understanding it intellectually is not the same as experiencing it. Knowledge cannot prepare you for the moment when your identity begins to crack. No theory can soften the anguish of realizing that much of your life has been spent serving a version of yourself that isn't even real. So tonight, we will not merely think about this process. We will feel it. We will walk through it together as if it were a landscape, descending into the valleys where false selves are formed, climbing the mountains where they must be confronted, and finally standing in the open field where authenticity awaits, raw and uncertain, but ultimately liberating. Over the next 2 hours, you will encounter stories of individuals who face this reckoning, of civilizations that built entire cultures on false collective identities, of thinkers who dedicated their lives to understanding the masks we wear. You will hear about the psychology behind persona construction, the philosophy of authentic existence, and the neuroscience of self-concept dissolution. But more than anything, you will be invited to examine your own masks, your own performances, your own hidden exhaustion from playing roles that no longer fit. By the end of this journey, you may not have all the answers. You may not know exactly who you are without your false selves, but you will understand why the pain of letting go is not something to be avoided or medicated or pushed away. You will see it for what it truly is, the only path to becoming real. There is a story told in many cultures with many variations, but the essence remains the same. A person goes to a wise teacher and says, "I want to know my true self." The teacher looks at them and says, "First tell me who you think you are." The person lists all their identities, their profession, their relationships, their beliefs, their accomplishments, and the teacher, one by one, strips each away. That is not you. That is not you. That is not you. Until finally the person sits in confused silence and the teacher says, "Now we can begin." Tonight we begin. We begin by acknowledging that this work is not for the faint of heart. It requires a kind of courage that our modern world rarely celebrates. Not the courage to conquer or achieve, but the courage to surrender and dissolve. It asks you to become nothing so you can become anything. It demands you release your grip on certainty so you can touch truth. And it hurts. Dear friends, it hurts in ways that are difficult to articulate because they occur in regions of experience that language struggles to reach. It hurts like mourning because you are grieving versions of yourself that will never return. It hurts like birth because you are pushing something new and vulnerable into existence. It hurts like surgery because you are cutting away parts of yourself that have become infected with inauthenticity, even though the cutting requires you to heal from wounds you didn't know you had. But here is what the wise ones throughout history have always known. This pain is productive. It is generative. It is sacred. It is the pain that transforms rather than destroys, that opens rather than closes, that liberates rather than imprisons. So we sit with it tonight. We honor it. We do not run from it or rationalize it away. We let it speak, because it has something essential to teach us about the difference between the life we perform and the life we actually live. The question that will guide us through the hours ahead is not, how do I avoid this pain, but rather, what becomes possible once I stop running from it? What becomes possible when you stop performing and start existing? What emerges when the mask falls and there is no longer anything to hide behind? What remains when everything false has been burned away? These are the questions that have obsessed the greatest minds across millennia. They are also the questions that haunt you in quiet moments, when you can no longer avoid yourself. Tonight we give those questions the attention they deserve. Take a breath. Feel the weight of this moment. You are here now, choosing to look at what most people spend their entire lives avoiding. That choice itself is an act of profound bravery. The journey begins not with answers, but with presence. Not with solutions, but with acknowledgement. Not with the promise of easy transformation, but with the honest recognition that true transformation is never easy. And so, with clear eyes and open hearts, we step into the darkness where false selves are made and unmade. We enter the theater of consciousness where every role you've ever played waits to be examined. We descend into the archaeology of identity, where layer upon layer of accumulated selfhood can be carefully excavated and understood. The pain of letting go awaits us, but so does something else, something luminous and undefined, something that can only be found once the false has been released. Are you ready? Not to find yourself, but to lose everything you thought you were, so that what remains might finally be true? Then let us begin the descent. Let us journey into the origins of false identity, into the moment when the first mask was placed upon the authentic face of being, into the forgotten reasons why you learned to be someone other than yourself. The theater is dark, the curtain rises, and the performance of a lifetime, the performance where you finally stop performing, is about to begin. Every false self has a birth story. Every mask has a moment of creation. And if we trace those origins back far enough, we arrive at a profound and uncomfortable truth. You learn to lie about who you are because telling the truth was dangerous. Let us return to the beginning. Not the beginning of your life, but the beginning of your false life. The moment when authenticity became a risk you could not afford to take. You were born without a mask. This is not poetry. This is neuroscience. Infants do not perform. They do not calculate how to be perceived. They cry when uncomfortable, laugh when delighted, reach for what attracts them, and recoil from what frightens them. They are pure responsiveness, unfiltered presence, a consciousness not yet taught to hide itself. But then something happens. The world responds to the child's authenticity with judgment, with conditions, with the unspoken message. You cannot be yourself and be loved. You must become what we need you to be. The pioneering psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called this the creation of the false self, a protective structure that develops when the authentic self is rejected or misunderstood. The child learns quickly, my real feelings are too much for my parents. My actual needs threaten the family system. My genuine expression causes discomfort or anger or withdrawal, and so, to survive, to maintain the attachment bonds upon which my life depends, I must hide who I am and become who they need me to be. This is not conscious manipulation. It is adaptation. It is the organism responding to its environment with a kind of tragic genius, constructing a personality that will maximize acceptance and minimize rejection. Consider the child who loves to sing, to dance, to express joy loudly and physically, but who grows up in a household where noise is punished and exuberance is seen as disrespectful. That child learns to become quiet, contained, serious. The vibrant self goes underground. The acceptable self takes center stage. And years later, that person sits in a therapist's office saying, I don't know why I feel so empty inside. I don't know why nothing brings me joy. Or consider the child who is naturally sensitive, introspective, emotional, but who is raised in an environment that values toughness, that mocks vulnerability, that equates feeling with weakness. That child learns to build walls around their heart, to intellectualize rather than feel, to present a facade of strength while their emotional life atrophies in the darkness. And decades later, they wonder why their relationships feel hollow, why they cannot connect, why they sense they are living behind glass. Or consider the child who is brilliant, curious, always questioning, but who quickly learns that adults are threatened by questions, that curiosity is labeled as difficult, that thinking independently is punished as disobedience. That child learns to become compliant, to suppress their questions, to mold themselves into someone easier to manage. And years pass, and they find themselves in a career that bores them, in a life that feels like it belongs to someone else, with a mind that has forgotten how to wonder. These are not rare stories. These are your stories. Different details, perhaps, but the same essential pattern. Authenticity was unsafe, so a false self was constructed to take its place. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung spent his life exploring this phenomenon. He called these constructed identities personas, masks we wear to interface with the world. The word itself comes from the Latin for the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theatre, masks that would project a particular character to the audience while hiding the actual face of the performer. Jung understood that personas are necessary and normal. We need different presentations for different contexts. The problem arises when we forget that the persona is a mask, when we mistake the role for the reality, when we become so identified with our performances that we lose contact with the performer beneath. He wrote, "The danger is that people become identical with their personas, the professor with his textbook, the tenor with his voice. Then the damage is done. Henceforth the person is based upon a self-perception that is purely illusory." This is the tragedy we are exploring tonight. Not that we wear masks, but that we forget we are wearing them. We become our job titles, our social roles, our carefully curated images, and somewhere in that identification, the authentic self is buried so deeply that we no longer remember it exists. But let us go even deeper into these origins. Let us examine not just the psychological mechanisms, but the philosophical and cultural dimensions of false self-construction. The existentialist philosophers, Sartre, Camus, Heidegger, were obsessed with a concept they called bad faith, the act of lying to yourself about your own freedom and responsibility. Sartre described the waiter who is so absorbed in playing the role of waiter that he has become a kind of automaton, no longer a free human being making choices, but a pre-programmed function executing a script. This is what happens when the false self takes over completely. You become a role rather than a person. You execute the program rather than making conscious choices. You are, in Sartre's language, living inauthentically, denying your fundamental freedom to choose who you become by rigidly identifying with a fixed identity. Heidegger used the German word Dasein to describe authentic human existence, literally being there, present to one's own experience. But he observed that most people fall into what he called das Man, the anonymous they, the collective voice that dictates how one should live, what one should value, who one should become. People living in das Man are not truly existing, they are conforming to an external script, performing a role assigned by culture rather than chosen through authentic engagement with existence. Can you feel this in your own life? The moments when you catch yourself doing something not because you want to, but because people like you are supposed to want it? The times when you express an opinion not because you believe it, but because it aligns with your social group's expectations? The relationships you maintain not because they nourish you, but because ending them would contradict the story you've told about yourself? These are the subtle ways the false self operates. It is not usually dramatic or obvious. It is the slow accumulation of small compromises, little betrayals of authenticity, tiny moments when you chose acceptance over honesty. And the tragedy is that these compromises make sense. They are rational responses to social reality. As the sociologist Irving Goffman documented in his work on self-presentation, we are all engaged in constant impression management, adjusting our behavior to control how others perceive us. This is not pathological, it is social necessity. We cannot function in human society without some ability to modulate our expression, to present different aspects of ourselves in different contexts. But Goffman also noted a crucial distinction. There is a difference between impression management, adjusting your presentation while remaining aware you are doing so, and complete identification with the role. There is a difference between consciously performing a role and forgetting you are performing. The latter is where suffering begins. When you lose the boundary between the mask and the face, when the performance becomes so ingrained that you can no longer find the performer, when the false self is no longer a tool you use but a prison you inhabit, that is when the pain starts to accumulate, slowly, like water building behind a dam, until one day the pressure becomes unbearable and something must break. Let us now examine the neuroscience of this process, because the formation of false selves is not merely philosophical or psychological. It is written into the very structure of your brain. The human brain constructs a sense of self through a complex network of neural processes. Neuroscientists have identified what they call the default mode network, a set of brain regions that activate when we are at rest, mind-wandering, thinking about ourselves and others. This network is essentially your self-referential processing system, the neural machinery that maintains your sense of continuous identity across time. But here is what researchers have discovered. This network does not distinguish between authentic and false aspects of identity. It simply maintains whatever story you have told yourself about who you are. If that story is deeply inauthentic, if it is built on false premises and self-deception, your brain will nevertheless work tirelessly to maintain it, to filter information in ways that confirm it, to reject experiences that contradict it. This is called cognitive dissonance reduction in psychology, and it is one of the most powerful forces in human consciousness. Your brain will literally distort reality to maintain consistency with your self-concept, even if that self-concept is fundamentally false. Think about what this means. You have a sophisticated neural system dedicated to maintaining your false self. Your brain has learned the pathways of your performance so well that it executes them automatically. The mask has been worn so long that it has shaped the contours of your face beneath it. This is why letting go is so painful and so difficult. You are not just changing your mind about who you are. You are attempting to rewire neural pathways that have been reinforced for decades. You are trying to dismantle a structure that your brain perceives as essential for survival. And your brain resists. Oh, how it resists. When you begin to question your false self, when you start to let go of comfortable identities, your nervous system interprets this as a threat. Anxiety spikes. Depression may emerge. You might experience what feels like an existential crisis, a dissolving of the boundaries that previously gave your life structure and meaning. Neuroscientists studying psychedelic experiences, which often involve temporary dissolution of the ego, have observed dramatic changes in brain activity during these states. The default mode network quiets down, the rigid patterns of self-referential thinking relax, and people report feeling connected to something larger than their individual identity, experiencing what they describe as their true self or a sense of unity with existence itself. This research suggests that the ordinary egoic self, the self that says I am this and not that, is not as solid as it seems. It is a pattern, a habit, a story reinforced by repetition. And when the brain's storytelling network quiets down, what remains is often described as more fundamental, more real, more authentic. But you do not need psychedelics to access this understanding. What you need is the courage to question the story your brain has been telling, to sit with the discomfort when familiar patterns are disrupted, to resist the urge to immediately construct a new false self to replace the old one. Now, let us travel even further back into the origins of false self, into the realm of evolutionary psychology and anthropology. Why are humans so prone to self-deception? Why did we evolve the capacity to lie to ourselves so convincingly? The evolutionary psychologist Robert Trivers proposed a fascinating theory. Self-deception evolved because it makes us better at deceiving others. If you genuinely believe your own lies, You do not exhibit the tells and inconsistencies that would reveal conscious lying. The person who truly believes they are confident, generous, and principled will be more convincing in social situations than someone who is consciously faking these qualities. In ancestral environments where social cooperation and status were crucial for survival and reproduction, the ability to present oneself favorably and to believe one's own favorable self-presentation would have been strongly selected for. We are the descendants of people who were skilled at constructing convincing personas, at believing their own narratives, at deceiving themselves into social success. This means that the tendency toward false self is not a modern pathology. It is written into your evolutionary heritage. You are not broken for having false selves. You are, in a sense, doing exactly what millions of years of evolution programmed you to do. But here is the twist that makes our current moment in history so significant. We now live in conditions radically different from those in which these tendencies evolved. We have technologies that allow us to present curated versions of ourselves to thousands or millions of people. We have social media platforms that reward performance and punish authenticity. We have economic systems that require us to package ourselves as products. We have cultural narratives that tell us who we should be, what we should want, how we should live. The ordinary human capacity for persona construction has been hijacked by modernity, amplified beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. The result is an epidemic of inauthenticity, a civilization of people who no longer know how to be real because they have spent their entire lives practicing how to be appealing, successful, impressive, likable, anything but true. The cultural critic and philosopher Byung-Chul Han writes about what he calls the transparency society, a world where everyone is constantly visible, constantly performing, constantly engaged in what he calls the hell of the same. In this world, genuine difference is smoothed away in favor of marketable personas. Authenticity becomes just another product to be consumed, another performance to be perfected. We curate our lives for Instagram, crafting images that suggest adventure, happiness, success, while behind the camera, we might be anxious, lonely, struggling. We write LinkedIn posts that present a narrative of constant growth and achievement, while privately we doubt our competence and question our path. We present faces to the world that show confidence, control, contentment, while inside, the authentic self whispers, "This is not me, this is not my life." And yet, we cannot stop. We cannot simply remove the masks because we have forgotten what our actual faces look like. We cannot return to authenticity because we never learned what authenticity means. This is the origin story we all share, with different details, but the same essential arc. You learned to be false because being true was not safe. You constructed a self to show the world, because showing your actual self risked rejection, shame, punishment, isolation. You became skilled at the performance because the alternative was to face the primal terror of not belonging, and now, decades later, you find yourself imprisoned by your own creation. The false self that was meant to protect you has become your jailer. The mask that was supposed to help you navigate the world has fused to your skin. The performance that once felt like survival now feels like a kind of death. This is where Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins, at the moment when protection becomes prison, when the very strategies that helped you survive begin to suffocate you, when the pain of maintaining the false self becomes greater than the pain of letting it go. But before we move into that descent, let us mark this moment with a recognition of what we have uncovered. You are not weak for having false selves. You are human. You adapted to a world that demanded adaptation. You survived conditions that required you to hide. And the masks you wear are testaments to your resilience, to your profound capacity to do what needed to be done. But resilience that once saved you can become rigidity that imprisons you. Adaptation that was necessary in childhood can become maladaptive in adulthood. And the time comes, perhaps it is coming now, when you must choose between the safety of the known false self and the terrifying freedom of the unknown authentic one. The origins have been revealed, the mechanisms have been examined, the stage has been set. Now we must face what comes next, the moment when the false self begins to crack, when the performance becomes unsustainable, when everything you built to protect yourself starts to crumble. This is the descent we must take together. This is the darkness we must enter. This is the collapse that precedes awakening. There is a kind of suffering that our modern world has no name for. It is not depression, though it shares some features. It is not anxiety, though it manifests with similar intensity. It is not trauma, though it can feel equally devastating. It is the suffering of maintaining a false self that has become unsustainable, the pain of living a life that looks successful from the outside while feeling hollow from the inside, the agony of performing a version of yourself that increasingly feels like a lie. Psychologists sometimes call this existential pain or spiritual crisis, but these terms barely touch the experience. It is the sensation of drowning while everyone around you thinks you are swimming. It is the feeling of screaming while only producing socially acceptable speech. It is the experience of dying while your body continues to move through the motions of living. This is the crisis we enter now, the moment when the false self, maintained for so long at such great cost, begins to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Let me tell you about a woman named Sarah, though her real name does not matter, because she is every person who has ever built a life on foundations that were not their own. Sarah was successful by every external measure. She had the prestigious career her parents dreamed of, the stable relationship her friends envied, the carefully curated social media presence that suggested a life of fulfillment and purpose. She had learned to be who others needed her to be with such skill that she received constant validation for her performance. But at 37, sitting in her expensive apartment after another day of pretending, Sarah realized she could not remember the last time she had felt anything real. Not the performative emotions she displayed in meetings or social gatherings, not the appropriate responses she had learned to generate for every situation, but actual feeling, raw, unmediated, authentic emotional experience. She looked at her life as if from a great distance and recognized none of it. The career she had spent 15 years building suddenly seemed like someone else's ambition. The relationship she maintained felt like a contractual arrangement rather than love. The friendships she kept required so much energy to sustain because they were based on the version of herself that was likable rather than true. And in that moment of recognition, something inside her began to break. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but like ice cracking on a frozen lake. First a small fracture, then spreading lines of weakness, then the terrifying sense that the surface she had been standing on was not solid at all, that it might give way at any moment, plunging her into dark water. This is how the collapse begins, not with a bang but with a whisper, not with obvious catastrophe but with subtle erosion. You start to notice the disconnection. You catch yourself going through motions that feel mechanical. You observe the words coming out of your mouth and think, that is not what I actually believe. That is what I am supposed to say. The psychologist Carl Rogers, founder of person-centered therapy, observed this phenomenon in hundreds of clients. He noticed that people in distress often described a growing gap between their organismic self, their actual moment-to-moment experience, and their self-concept, the story they had constructed about who they were supposed to be. The larger this gap becomes, the more psychological suffering a person experiences. Rogers wrote, "When I am not prized and accepted for what I am, I begin to regard myself as unprisable. I withdraw from others, and I try to become the person who is prized." In other words, you learn to abandon yourself before others could abandon you. You preemptively rejected your authentic nature to avoid the pain of being rejected by others, and now, years or decades later, you are suffering from the consequences of that bargain. The crack widens. Small rebellions begin to emerge. Maybe you cancel social obligations you previously would have forced yourself to attend. Maybe you notice yourself saying no when you used to automatically say yes. Maybe you start questioning beliefs you have held for years, wondering where they actually came from, whether you ever truly believed them or simply absorbed them from your environment. These are the first signs of the false self losing its grip, and they are accompanied by terror. Because here is what makes this stage so excruciating. You are losing your sense of identity without yet having a new one to replace it. You are dismantling the structure of the known self without any guarantee of what will take its place. You are letting go of comfortable lies, but have not yet found comfortable truths. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard called this the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that strikes when you realize that your identity is not fixed, that you are not bound by past choices, that you could, in principle, become something entirely different. This realization is both liberating and terrifying. It means possibility, but it also means uncertainty. It means freedom, but it also means responsibility. Most people, faced with this vertigo, retreat. They reinforce the old identity, push down the doubts, medicate the discomfort, distract themselves with activity or substance or entertainment. They choose the familiar suffering of the false self over the unfamiliar suffering of transformation. But some people, perhaps you are one of them, find that retreat is no longer possible. The cracks have spread too far. The performance has become too exhausting. The gap between who you are and who you pretend to be has grown so wide that you can no longer ignore it. And so you enter what the mystics call the dark night of the soul, what psychologists call identity crisis, what we might simply call the necessary destruction that precedes reconstruction. Let us examine the phenomenology of this experience more closely, because understanding what is happening can provide some orientation when everything feels like chaos. The psychiatrist Kazimierz Dąbrowski developed a theory he called positive disintegration, the idea that psychological crisis and breakdown are not pathologies to be immediately suppressed, but potentially necessary stages in authentic development. He observed that people who undergo significant personal transformation often pass through periods of intense anxiety, depression, and existential questioning. The disintegration of old structures, rigid beliefs, false selves, inherited values, creates the space for genuine integration at a higher level of complexity. Dąbrowski wrote, "The processes of disintegration at times are painful, tragic, and psychologically painful. Nevertheless, for those individuals who are capable of passing through them, these processes are necessary for positive development." This perspective radically challenges our culture's approach to psychological distress. We are taught to view suffering as a problem to be solved, discomfort as a signal that something is wrong. But what if some suffering is not dysfunction but function? What if the pain of letting go of false selves is not a disorder but an order reasserting itself? Consider what happens in the body when a bone breaks. The initial trauma is followed by inflammation, pain, swelling, responses that feel like problems but are actually the beginning of healing. The bone must be broken before it can be set correctly and heal stronger than before. You do not say the inflammation is wrong. You recognize it as part of the process. Similarly, the psychological pain of the false self-crumbling is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that you are doing something necessary. The inflammation of the soul precedes its healing. But let us be honest about what this feels like from the inside. Let us not romanticize the suffering or pretend it is easy simply because it is meaningful. You wake up one morning and the life you have been living feels like a costume that no longer fits. Every action requires conscious effort that used to be automatic. Getting dressed, going to work, engaging in conversation, tasks that once required no thought now feel like wading through deep water. You are exhausted from the constant vigilance of maintaining a self that wants to collapse. Your relationships begin to strain. People who knew you as one thing start to sense that something has changed. They may respond with confusion, concern, or even hostility. They liked the old you, the predictable you, the you that played a specific role in their lives. This new uncertainty unsettles them. Some friendships will not survive this transition. Some relationships were based entirely on your false self, and when that self dissolves, the relationship has no authentic foundation to stand on. This is another kind of pain, the grief of losing connections that felt important but were never truly real. Your sense of purpose may evaporate. The goals you were pursuing suddenly seem arbitrary or meaningless. The career path that once excited you now feels like someone else's dream that you inherited. The future you were working toward looks increasingly like a destination you never actually wanted to reach. And beneath all of this, a whisper that sometimes becomes a roar. Who am I without my story? What remains when everything false has been stripped away? The ego does not surrender easily. It was built as a survival mechanism, and it will fight for its existence with every tool at its disposal. It will generate anxiety to convince you that authenticity is dangerous. It will produce shame to make you believe that your real self is unacceptable. It will create elaborate rationalizations for why the old patterns should be maintained, why this discomfort is temporary, why you should just push through and everything will stabilize. But something in you knows better. Some part of your consciousness has seen through the illusion and cannot unsee it. You are like the person who takes the red pill in the Matrix. Reality will never look the same, and there is no going back to comfortable ignorance. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche understood this crisis intimately. His concept of the death of God was not merely about religious belief, but about the collapse of all external authorities that give life meaning. When the old sources of value and identity crumble, when the structures that told you who to be lose their power, you are left in what Nietzsche called the desert, a landscape of nihilism where nothing has inherent meaning. But Nietzsche did not see this as the end of the story. He saw it as the necessary precondition for authentic value creation. Only after the death of false gods can you become what he called the Übermensch, not a superman in the fascist sense, but a human being who takes responsibility for creating their own values, their own meaning, their own identity. He wrote, "You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you rise anew if you have not first become ashes? This is the fire you are in now, the flames that consume the false self, the burning that must precede rebirth. And here is what makes this stage so lonely. Most people around you will not understand what you are going through. They may offer well-meaning advice. Just think positive. Everyone struggles sometimes. You just need to find your passion. Have you tried meditation? These suggestions, while kindly intended, miss the profundity of what is occurring. You are not looking for a new hobby or a mindset adjustment. You are undergoing an ontological transformation, a reconstruction of being itself. The psychiatrist R.D. Laing, studying what mainstream psychiatry labeled as schizophrenic breaks, suggested that some psychological crises were actually breakthrough rather than breakdown. The psyche's attempt to break through false structures to reach something more authentic. He argued that the medicalization of these experiences often prevented their natural resolution, stopping the process halfway through and leaving the person stuck. While we must be careful not to romanticize severe mental illness, Laing's core insight remains valuable. Not all psychological upheaval is pathological. Sometimes the psyche must destroy to create, must dissolve to reform, must die to be reborn. This is where you find yourself now, in the liminal space between selves, in the void where the old has died, but the new has not yet been born. In what the mythologist Joseph Campbell called the belly of the whale, that dark, transformative space in the hero's journey where everything familiar is stripped away. Campbell studied myths from cultures around the world and found this pattern repeated. The hero must leave the familiar world, descend into darkness, face trials and death, and only then can they return transformed. The descent is not optional. The darkness is not a detour. The death is not a failure. These are the necessary stations on the journey toward authentic life, but myths are easier to tell than to live. when you are in the belly of the whale, when the false self is crumbling around you, when every certainty has become a question, the experience is not adventurous, it is terrifying. You may find yourself grieving, not just for relationships or opportunities lost, but for the versions of yourself that are dying. Even false selves deserve to be mourned. They served you once. They protected you when you needed protection. They helped you survive conditions you might not have survived otherwise. So we pause here to honor them, to say, thank you for keeping me safe. Thank you for helping me navigate a world that felt dangerous. Thank you for doing your best with the tools you had. And then, gently but firmly, but I no longer need you. I am strong enough now to face the world without masks. I am brave enough to be seen as I actually am. Your job is complete. You can rest now. This is the moment of letting go, not bitter or angry, but with gratitude and gentleness. The false self was not your enemy. It was your protector who did not know when to stop protecting. But the grief is real. You are mourning possibilities that will never be realized because they were based on false foundations. You are saying goodbye to futures that looked promising but were never truly yours. You are releasing relationships with people who loved your mask but never met your face. And in this grief, in this loss, in this dying, something strange begins to happen. A space opens up. A silence emerges where there used to be constant mental chatter about who you should be and how you should appear. The anxiety begins to shift, not disappearing, but changing quality from panic about maintaining the false self to anticipation about what might emerge in its absence. You start to notice moments, brief, fleeting, but unmistakable, when you act from some deeper place, when you say something true without calculating its effect, when you make a choice based on actual preference rather than expected role, when you feel something real, even if it is uncomfortable, even if it does not fit the story you have been telling. These moments are small. They might last only seconds, but they feel different. They feel like breathing after years of holding your breath. They feel like solid ground after swimming in the ocean for too long. This is the beginning of authentic presence. Not a new false self to replace the old one, not a more sophisticated mask, but actual, immediate, unglamorous reality. The experience of being rather than becoming. The present moment rather than the story about the present moment. The neuroscience of this transition is fascinating. Research shows that when people undergo profound identity shifts, there are measurable changes in brain activity. The default mode network, that collection of brain regions responsible for self-referential thinking, shows reduced activity. Meanwhile, regions associated with present moment awareness and sensory experience become more active. It is as if the brain is literally rewiring itself, loosening the rigid patterns of the false self and creating space for more fluid, responsive ways of being. The neural pathways of performance begin to quiet. The neural pathways of presence begin to strengthen. But this rewiring does not happen smoothly or linearly. It is messy, inconsistent, frustrating. One day you feel like you have accessed something true and profound. The next day you are back in old patterns, performing old roles, wondering if anything has actually changed. This is normal. This is the process. Transformation is not a straight line. It is a spiral, circling back over familiar territory, but each time from a slightly higher vantage point. The Buddhist traditions speak of this in terms of attachment to self. The suffering comes not from having a self, but from clinging to a particular version of self, from insisting that you must be this and cannot be that. When the clinging loosens, when the attachment to a fixed identity dissolves, what remains is not absence but openness, a capacity to be many things without being definitively any one thing. This is both liberating and destabilizing. Liberation because you are no longer trapped in a rigid story. Destabilizing because humans crave certainty, and identity is one of our most cherished forms of certainty. So you oscillate between the comfort of the known false self and the uncertainty of the unknown authentic self. between the safety of the mask and the vulnerability of the face, between the story and the truth. And gradually, imperceptibly, the balance shifts. The false self loses its grip. Not because you have destroyed it through force of will, but because you have stopped feeding it with belief. You have stopped believing your own performance. You have stopped investing energy in maintaining the illusion. What happens then? Sometimes nothing dramatic. Sometimes just a quiet sense that you can breathe more deeply, that your shoulders can drop, that you do not have to be on guard in quite the same way. Sometimes just the ability to tolerate not knowing who you are without immediately rushing to construct a new identity. But sometimes something more profound occurs. Sometimes the collapse of the false self reveals what was always there beneath it. Not another constructed identity, but a capacity for presence, for response, for authentic engagement with whatever arises. This is not the same as finding yourself. It is more like losing yourself in the best possible sense, letting go of the rigid boundaries that separate me from not me, releasing the need to defend a particular identity, opening to the possibility that you are larger and more mysterious than any story you could tell about yourself. The mystics have been trying to describe this state for millennia. They speak of it as union with God, or dissolution of ego, or enlightenment. But these terms can be misleading, suggesting something exotic or unattainable. What we are discussing is simpler and more fundamental, the possibility of living from authenticity rather than from performance, from presence rather than from persona. This is where Act 2 ends, not with resolution, but with possibility. The false self has crumbled. The crisis has been entered. The pain has been felt. But you are still here. You have survived the very thing you were most afraid of, the loss of your constructed identity. And you have discovered that existence continues even when the story ends. What remains? What emerges in the space where the false self used to be? What kind of life becomes possible when you stop performing and start living? These are the questions that guide us into Act 3, into the territory of awakening, into the profound and practical realization that follows the death of false selves. But before we move forward, let us acknowledge where we have been. We have descended into the origin of masks, traced the construction of false identity, and then watched as those constructions crumbled under the weight of their own contradictions. We have sat with the pain of this collapse, honored its necessity, and refused to look away from its difficulty. You are still here. Despite everything, you are still here. That itself is evidence of something indestructible beneath all the false layers, something that remains when everything else has fallen away. That something is what we will explore next. That something is what has been waiting, patient and silent, for you to finally stop performing long enough to notice it. In the silence after the collapse, something unexpected happens. Not a grand revelation, not a sudden enlightenment, but something quieter and more profound. You begin to notice what remains when everything false has been stripped away. At first, this remaining presence is so subtle that you might miss it entirely. You are looking for something dramatic, some clear sense of, this is who I really am. But what you find instead is more like a quality of awareness, a way of meeting experience, a capacity to be present without needing to be anyone in particular. This is the authentic self, though calling it a self might be misleading. It is not another identity to replace the false ones. It is not a new mask, more honest than the others. It is closer to a way of being than a thing you are. It is the consciousness that was always there before you learned to perform, the awareness that continues whether you are playing a role or not, the presence that needs no story to justify its existence. The Zen Buddhists have a phrase for this: original face before your parents were born. What did you look like before you were taught what you should look like? What were you before you learned what you should be? That primordial presence, unconditioned, unconstructed, simply here. That is what awakens when the false selves fall away. But let us be very careful here. The trap that awaits at this stage is to turn authenticity into yet another performance, to make being authentic into a new identity you must maintain. This is how the ego survives its own death, by co-opting the language of authenticity and creating a new, subtler false self. You see this everywhere in modern culture. People who perform authenticity for social media, curating a carefully spontaneous image. Spiritual teachers who create a persona of enlightenment. Self-help gurus who market their true self brand. The ego is cunning. It will wear any costume, even the costume of having no costume. So the awakening we are discussing is not about finding a new identity, authentic or otherwise. It is about discovering a way of being that does not depend on identity at all. It is about learning to live from presence rather than from concept, from direct experience rather than from story. Let me tell you about a man named David. After years of maintaining the false self of a successful executive, confident, decisive, always in control, he experienced a breakdown that forced him to step away from his career. In the months that followed, stripped of his professional identity and the respect it commanded, he went through something he later described as becoming nobody. He spent days doing nothing in particular, not meditating or engaging in spiritual practice, but simply sitting with his own existence without any agenda. At first, this was excruciating. His mind constantly tried to construct a new story. I am someone who is taking time for self-discovery. I am healing. I am preparing for my next chapter. But gradually, these stories lost their power. They revealed themselves as just more thinking, more narrative construction, more ego trying to maintain itself. And in the spaces between these thoughts, something else became apparent. A simple awareness of being alive, the sensation of breathing, the play of light through the window, the sound of traffic in the distance. Not special or mystical, just immediate and present. Not David experiencing these things, but experience itself, happening, with no particular owner. He described it like this: I realized I had spent my whole life thinking about my life instead of living it. Even my attempts to find myself were just more thinking, more storytelling. When I finally stopped trying to be anyone, even stopped trying to be authentic, there was just this presence. Nothing special, nothing dramatic. Just life, happening. This is the awakening. Not a grand transformation, but a simple return to what was always present. Not becoming someone new, but ceasing to pretend to be someone at all. The philosopher Alan Watts spent his life trying to articulate this shift in consciousness. He described the ego as a kind of hallucination, a persistent feeling that there is a separate self that has experiences rather than recognizing that you are the experience. When this hallucination dissolves, what remains is not a void, but rather the fullness of immediate reality, no longer filtered through the lens of self-concern. Watts wrote, "The ego is a social institution with no physical reality. The ego is simply your symbol of yourself. When you realize that the symbol is not the same as the reality it represents, you can get into the infinite consciousness. But we must be practical here. You cannot walk through the world without some sense of self. You need a functional identity to navigate social reality, to make decisions, to engage with others. The awakening is not about destroying the self, but about changing your relationship to it. You recognize identity as a tool rather than mistaking it for truth. You can put on and take off different roles without believing any of them are fundamentally who you are. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuating, not finding your true self as a fixed essence, but becoming conscious of the process by which you construct and maintain selfhood. The individuated person is not someone who has discovered their one true identity, but someone who understands that identity is fluid, contextual, and always provisional. How does this look in practice? How do you actually live from this understanding? First, there is a quality of lightness that emerges. Not levity or lack of seriousness, but rather a sense that nothing is quite as solid or important as it previously seemed. You can engage fully with your life, your relationships, your work, but without the heaviness of needing everything to confirm your identity. You are not defending a self because you know there is nothing to defend. Second, there is increased responsiveness. When you are not constantly filtering experience through the question, "What does this mean about me?" you can respond more directly to what is actually happening. You see more clearly. You hear more accurately. You are less caught in your own projections and interpretations. Third, there is freedom in relationships. You no longer need others to validate your identity because you are not attached to any particular identity. You can let people see you as they see you without needing to control their perception. You can show up as you actually are, which may be different in different contexts, without anxiety about consistency. Fourth, there is a strange coexistence of seriousness and play. You take your responsibilities seriously, but hold your identity lightly. You engage meaningfully with life while recognizing the essentially playful, impermanent nature of all forms. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps, wrote about something he called tragic optimism, the ability to maintain meaning and engagement with life even in the face of suffering and absurdity. This is possible when your sense of meaning is not dependent on maintaining a particular identity or achieving specific outcomes. Meaning arises from authentic engagement with what is, not from successfully performing who you think you should be. Frankl observed that the prisoners who survived the camps were often those who found meaning beyond their own survival, caring for others, maintaining their inner integrity, envisioning a future purpose. They could endure almost anything as long as they were connected to something authentic. Those who were only trying to survive, trying to maintain their identity or save their ego, often could not sustain the will to live. This is the power of authentic presence. It is resilient in a way that false selves never can be, because it is not dependent on external circumstances. The false self needs constant validation, achievement, recognition. The authentic presence needs nothing because it is not a thing that can be gained or lost. It simply is. But let us not romanticize this awakening. It does not solve all problems. It does not make life easy or pain-free. You still experience loss, failure, rejection, suffering. What changes is your relationship to these experiences. They no longer threaten your fundamental being because you are no longer identified with a vulnerable, constructed self. The Stoic philosophers understood this. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The Stoics were not advocating emotional numbness, but rather a recognition that your essential nature is not touched by external circumstances. Fortunes change, roles change, the body ages, but the awareness that witnesses all of this remains fundamentally unchanged. This is what awakens when false selves fall away. Not a new self, but the recognition of awareness itself. The consciousness that was always present, but obscured by identification with changing phenomena. Now, practically, how do you cultivate this way of being? How do you stabilize this awakening so it is not just a fleeting insight, but a lived reality? The answer is both simpler and more difficult than you might expect. You practice presence, not as a technique to achieve some future state, but as a continual return to what is actually happening right now. When you notice yourself caught in story, worrying about how you are perceived, rehearsing what you will say, analyzing what just happened, you gently return to direct experience. The sensation of breathing, the feeling of your body, the sounds around you, the immediacy of this moment. This is not about stopping thought or achieving some special state. It is about recognizing when you are lost in mental construction and choosing to return to direct experience. Over and over, thousands of times, until the returning becomes more natural than the leaving. The meditation teacher Shinzen Jung describes this as concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity. You develop the ability to focus attention, concentration, to notice subtle aspects of experience, sensory clarity, and to allow experience to be as it is without resistance, equanimity. These are not mystical practices, but trainable skills that gradually shift your default relationship to experience. But practice alone is not enough. You also need what the Buddhists call right view, an accurate understanding of how reality actually works. As long as you fundamentally believe that happiness comes from getting what you want and avoiding what you do not want, you will remain trapped in the cycle of the false self trying to control circumstances to maintain its identity. The awakening includes recognizing that this model is false. Happiness, or perhaps better, contentment or peace, does not come from arranging circumstances to suit your ego. It comes from releasing the attachment to having circumstances be any particular way. It comes from meeting reality as it is, rather than demanding it conform to your preferences. This does not mean passivity or accepting injustice. It means acting from clarity rather than from ego defensiveness. It means engaging with the world to reduce suffering and increase flourishing, but not because you need these outcomes to validate your identity. The activist Buddhist teacher Joanna Macy speaks about this as active hope, engaging with the world's suffering not from a place of ego-driven heroism, but from natural compassion that arises when you recognize your interconnection with all beings. When you are not defending a separate self, compassion is not an effort or a moral obligation. It is simply what naturally emerges from seeing clearly. So the authentic life is not about withdrawal or detachment. It is about engagement from a different ground. You care deeply about people and outcomes, but you are not enslaved by the need for particular results. You act with passion and commitment, but you hold your preferences lightly. You are in the world, but not of it, as the old spiritual phrase goes. What does this mean for the specific ways you construct your life, your career, your relationships, your daily choices? It means you begin to make decisions differently. Instead of asking, what will make me look good, or what will others think, or what should I do? You begin to ask, what is actually true in this situation? And what response arises from clarity rather than from fear or desire? This often leads to surprising choices. You might leave situations that looked good, but felt wrong. You might pursue paths that seem unconventional, but resonate with something authentic. You might find yourself caring less about markers of success that previously drove you and caring more about qualities like integrity, presence, genuine connection. Your relationships transform. Instead of performing for others or trying to manage their perception of you, you show up as you actually are, which might be uncertain, imperfect, still figuring things out. This kind of authenticity often deepens relationships because it creates space for others to also be real, or it reveals that certain relationships were based entirely on mutual performance and cannot survive actual honesty. Some people will not like this more authentic version of you. They preferred the mask. They felt comfortable with the role you played. Your authenticity threatens their own false selves by reminding them that other ways of being are possible. This is painful, but necessary. You cannot live an authentic life and please everyone. You must choose between truth and approval. But here is what you discover. The relationships that survive this transition become immeasurably richer. When two people can meet without masks, when authenticity meets authenticity, there is a quality of connection that performance can never achieve. It is less smooth, less predictable, sometimes more awkward. But it is real in a way that feels like coming home. Your relationship to failure and success also changes. When you are not identified with outcomes, failure does not threaten your being. It is simply information, feedback, part of the learning process. Similarly, success does not inflate your ego because you recognize it as a temporary configuration of circumstances rather than proof of your worth. This might sound like not caring, but it is the opposite. You care more deeply because your caring is not contaminated by ego investment. You engage more fully because you are not holding back to protect a vulnerable self. You risk more authentically because you know that no failure can touch what you essentially are. The paradox is that letting go of the need to succeed often leads to more success, not because success was the goal, but because you are no longer inhibited by fear of failure. You try things, you learn rapidly, you adapt. You create from genuine inspiration rather than from the need to prove something. But even more importantly, you realize that success and failure are not the meaningful categories. What matters is whether you are living from truth or from fear, from presence or from performance, from authenticity or from image management. This is the awakening, a complete reorganization of what you consider important, what you value, what you dedicate your life to. And yet, this awakening does not look particularly special from the outside. You might still have a job, pay bills, deal with mundane problems. But the quality with which you meet these ordinary experiences has fundamentally shifted. Where there was strain, there is now ease. Where there was anxiety, there is now curiosity. Where there was the need to be someone, there is now the freedom to simply be. This is not the end of growth or development. You continue to learn, to change, to evolve. But the process is no longer driven by the desperation of the false self trying to become adequate. It is driven by natural curiosity, by love of truth, by the pleasure of understanding. The neuroscientist Richard Davidson's research on long-term meditators shows measurable changes in brain function. Regions associated with anxiety and self-referential thinking show reduced activity. Regions associated with empathy, attention, and emotional regulation show enhanced function. The brain literally rewires itself to support this new way of being. But beyond neuroscience, beyond psychology, beyond philosophy, there is simply the lived experience of being more fully alive. Colors appear richer. Conversations feel more connected. Even difficult emotions, when met without resistance, have a kind of aliveness to them. You are no longer living life at one remove, filtered through constant self-consciousness. You are life itself, happening, moment by moment, without apology or explanation. This is what was always available, always present, waiting patiently beneath the layers of false selves. Not something you need to become, but something you need to stop preventing. Not a destination you arrive at, but a recognition of where you have always been. The ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu expressed this paradox beautifully. In pursuit of knowledge, every day something is added. In the practice of the Tao, every day something is dropped. Less and less do you need to force things until finally you arrive at non-action. When nothing is done, nothing is left undone. The authentic life is not about adding more achievements, more identities, more performances. It is about subtracting, dropping, letting go, until what remains is simple presence, responding naturally to what arises without the constant interference of ego trying to make everything mean something about itself. And yet, this is not passivity. It is the most active possible engagement with life because nothing is held back, nothing is filtered, nothing is performed. You are fully here, meeting each moment without the buffer of identity protecting you from direct experience. This is the gift that awaits on the other side of letting go. Not the perfect self, not the enlightened self, not even the true self in any fixed sense, but rather the freedom to be present, responsive, alive, without needing to be anyone in particular. We have traveled far together tonight, from the origins of false selves in childhood adaptation, through the painful crisis of their collapse, to the awakening that emerges when we finally stop performing and start living. We have explored this terrain through psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, and most importantly, through the felt experience of what it means to let go of comfortable lies and embrace uncomfortable truths. But now, we must address the question that has been implicit throughout this entire journey. What do you do with this understanding? How do you actually live differently, starting tomorrow, with the recognition that much of what you thought was your life was actually a performance? The answer is both simple and demanding. You practice honesty. Not the brutal honesty that uses truth as a weapon, but the gentle, persistent honesty that asks, What is actually true in this moment? Before you speak, before you act, before you present yourself to the world. You practice noticing when you slip into performance mode. You catch yourself calculating how to be perceived. You observe when you are saying what you should say rather than what you actually think. And in those moments, you pause. You breathe. You create a small space between stimulus and response, between the habit of the false self and the possibility of authentic presence. This is not about perfection. You will slip back into old patterns. You will find yourself performing again, protecting again, hiding again. This is natural and expected. The work is not to never wear masks, but to know when you are wearing them, to understand why you needed them, and to gently, gradually expand the contexts in which you can afford to be real. You will discover something remarkable. The more you practice authenticity, the less exhausting life becomes. All that energy you were spending on performance, on image management, on trying to be perceived in particular ways, that energy becomes available for actual living. You have more capacity for joy, for creativity, for connection, for presence, and you will also discover something challenging. Authenticity often means disappointing people. It means not meeting expectations. It means allowing others to be uncomfortable with who you actually are. This requires courage, not the heroic courage celebrated in movies, but the quiet courage of choosing truth over approval, day after day, moment after moment. The pain of letting go of false selves does not disappear entirely. Even years into this practice, you will encounter moments when you must choose between the safety of performance and the vulnerability of presence. But the quality of this pain changes. It becomes less like the crushing agony of a life unlived, and more like the sharp, clean pain of growth. Uncomfortable but generative, difficult but meaningful. Remember this: you are not alone in this struggle. Every human being, to some degree, is wrestling with the same question. Do I dare to be myself? Do I risk rejection by showing my actual face? Do I let go of the identity I have constructed and trust that something more authentic will emerge? Most people never consciously engage with these questions. They live their entire lives on autopilot, performing roles assigned by family, culture, economics, never stopping to ask if any of it is actually true to who they are. The fact that you are here, that you have stayed with this exploration for hours, that you are willing to look at your own masks without immediately looking away, this is evidence of something profound in you. That something is what Jung called the self with a capital S, not the ego self, but the deeper organizing principle of your psyche, the part of you that wants wholeness more than it wants comfort, that seeks truth more than it seeks approval, that is willing to undergo necessary suffering if it leads to authentic life. Listen to that part of yourself, trust it, even when it asks you to do things that feel risky or uncomfortable. It knows the way back to aliveness in a way that your calculating, protective ego never can. As we close, I want to leave you with a final thought, a question to carry with you beyond this moment. What if the purpose of your life is not to become someone impressive, not to achieve something remarkable, not to be admired or remembered, but simply to be fully present to your own existence? What if the meaning you have been seeking is found not in grand accomplishments, but in ordinary moments met with extraordinary presence? What if everything you thought mattered was actually distraction from the only thing that truly matters? Being awake to the miracle of being alive, being yourself, being here, now, real and vulnerable and courageously honest? What if the person you have been trying so hard to become is not nearly as interesting, not nearly as valuable, not nearly as beautiful as the person you already are beneath all the performance? This is not a question to answer intellectually. It is a question to live into, to experiment with, to discover through direct experience. It is an invitation to a different kind of life. Not a perfect life, not an easy life, but an authentic life. The theater is closing. The performance is ending. The lights are coming up on the real world, where real people live real lives, messy and uncertain and absolutely beautiful in their ordinariness. You have been given one life, this this body, this consciousness, these specific circumstances. And you can spend it performing for an audience that will never be satisfied, or you can spend it discovering what it feels like to simply be yourself without apology, without explanation, without masks. The choice, as it always has been, is yours. But now you know what the choice is. You cannot unknow it. You cannot return to innocent performance. You have seen the difference between the life you perform and the life you actually live. What will you do with this seeing? The pain of letting go of false selves is real. It is significant. It is not to be minimized or dismissed. But it is also temporary, while the freedom that emerges from authenticity is enduring. You can endure temporary pain for permanent freedom, or you can choose permanent pain to avoid temporary discomfort. The authentic life is not waiting for you in some distant future after you have done enough work or become good enough or figured everything out. It is available right now, in this breath, in this moment, if you are willing to drop the performance and meet reality as it actually is. So here is my final invitation. Stop trying to be anyone. Stop performing for imaginary audiences. Stop defending a self that does not need defending because it was never real in the first place. Just be present, be honest, be willing to not know who you are while you discover what you actually are. Be brave enough to disappoint people when necessary. Be gentle enough to forgive yourself for all the years of pretending. Be open enough to let authentic life reveal itself moment by moment. The ancient ones called this liberation. The mystics called it enlightenment. The psychologists call it individuation. But it is simpler than any of these grand words suggest. It is just you, finally, courageously, beautifully yourself. And that has always been enough. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. Thank you for your courage to look at what most people avoid. Thank you for your willingness to feel the pain of transformation rather than the numbness of staying the same. The journey continues, as it always does, one breath at a time, one honest moment at a time, one choice for truth over image at a time. May you find the courage to let your false selves die. May you discover what remains when the performance ends. May you live the one life you were actually given, rather than the many lives you thought you should live. The awakening is not dramatic. It is not elsewhere. It is right here, in the ordinary miracle of presence, available every moment you remember, to stop performing and start living. This is your invitation. This is your possibility. This is your life, waiting to be lived honestly. Will you accept it? The answer is already being written in every choice you make from this moment forward. Live well, live truly, live awake. For more explorations of consciousness, psychology, and the evolution of the human mind, join us on the next episode of Echoes of the Ancients. Until then, remember, the most radical act of rebellion in a world of performance is to simply, courageously be yourself.